Introduction. Hello and welcome to the 9th Tuffo installment. This installment is Violette1st, the ultimate family freakout 9.0. Introduction. Hello and welcome to the 9th Tuffo installment. This installment is much more violent than other installments. Bill is the main villain in this installment. This story is semi-unrealistic. This installment is very explosive. There are peaceful scenes when Violette and William are alone together. Start date, the 1st of March 2024. End date, the 17th of January 2024. Warning, if you find BB guns, arson, stuff getting blown up, mentions of curse words, fighting, random destruction, and punishment days make you uncomfortable. It is suggested that you don't watch this video. This was made for entertainment purposes only. With that out of the way, I hope you enjoy it. Plot, it is a peaceful the 24th of August morning in Mount Airy, Maryland. It is all peaceful. However, in the Anderson household, all chaos is about to break loose. We see a 55-year-old female, Violette, trying to wake up her 193-pound husband, Bill. Soon Violette's 17-year-old son, William, walks into his parents' bedroom. A few seconds later William starts shouting at his father to get out of bed for work. A few seconds later Violette drags Bill out of his bed. 1 second later Bill wakes up. A minute later Violette and the boys, William and Bill, walk downstairs for breakfast. A few seconds later Bill grabs a 5-pound bag of raw whole wheat flour. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill that he needs to eat a bowl of parfait. A few seconds later Bill sits down in his chair. A few seconds later Bill starts eating raw flour. 10 minutes later Bill finishes eating his powdery breakfast. A few seconds later Violette and William finish eating breakfast. A few seconds later Violette shouts for Bill to get his rear end into the kitchen. 1 minute later Violette tells the boys that they are going to Walmart for some much needed items. A few seconds later Bill says he has work. 1 second later Bill goes to get ready for the day. 20 minutes later Violette and William finish getting ready for the day. A few seconds later Violette tells William that he needs to get some school supplies. A few seconds later William grabs Violette's car keys. 1 minute later Violette and William get into Violette's SUV. A few minutes later Violette watches Bill get into his truck. 1 minute later Bill's truck speeds off. A few seconds later Violette and William speed off towards a Walmart. 10 minutes later Violette parks the SUV. A few seconds later Violette and William get out of the SUV. 20 seconds later they grab 2 carts. A few seconds later Violette and William walk away to get their shopping done. 20 minutes later Violette and William meet up at the checkout. 5 minutes later Violette pays for the check. 5 minutes later Violette and William get into the SUV. A few seconds later Violette gets a call from Bill's supervisor, Todd. Violette then sighs. A few seconds later Violette answers the call. 2 minutes later Violette is informed that Bill destroyed a $700 microwave. A few seconds later Violette ends the call. 1 second later Violette drives off to work Job Incorporated. 5 minutes later Violette parks the SUV. A few seconds later Violette sprints into the 8-story office building. 1 minute later Violette bolts into Todd's office. A few seconds later Todd tells Violette that Bill has one more chance before he gets fired. Violette then screams with all her might. A few seconds later Todd's manager explains that Bill is dismissed for the day. A few seconds later Violette drags Bill away. 2 minutes later Violette and the boys speed home. 5 minutes later Bill walks into the house. A few seconds later William and Violette walk into the house. A minute later Bill asks for lunch. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill that he has to help bring in the Walmart bags. A few seconds later Violette and the boys walk outside. 10 minutes later Violette finishes putting away her items she got from Walmart. A few seconds later Violette starts to prepare some grilled chicken sandwiches for lunch. 20 minutes later Violette calls for the boys. A few seconds later Bill grabs a chicken sandwich. A few seconds later William walks into the kitchen. 1 minute later Violette and William start eating chicken sandwiches. 10 minutes later Bill says he is stuffed after eating 4 pounds of chicken sandwiches. A few seconds later Violette starts to wash the dishes from lunch. A few seconds later Bill starts to watch TV. 5 minutes later Violette joins Bill. A few seconds later William starts to rage at his PS5. A few seconds later Bill screams at the top of his lungs. 5 seconds later Bill turns off the internet router. 10 seconds later William disconnects from his Xbox. A few seconds later William walks downstairs. 8 seconds later William roars at Bill. A few seconds later Bill punches his son. For roaring, Violette then gets up. A few seconds later Violette walks outside. 30 seconds later Violette walks back inside with a BB gun. 10 seconds later Violette shoots Bill's rear end. A few seconds later Bill screams very loudly. A few seconds later Violette rips the BB gun in half. 1 second later Bill tackles his wife. 3 seconds later William's parents get into a massive brawl. A few minutes later Violette gets up. A minute later Violette tells Bill he is close to getting a punishment day. A few seconds later Bill screams at the top of his lungs. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill that he has to be on his best behavior. A few seconds later Bill tells Violette that he will be better. A minute later Violette and the boys watch TV. A few seconds later Bill suggests they should watch Cocomelon. A few seconds later Violette explodes with laughter. William then joins Violette. 1 minute later Violette tells Bill that Cocomelon is for a younger audience. Bill then starts crying. A few seconds later Violette sighs while getting Cocomelon ready. A minute later Bill stares into the TV. A few minutes later Violette sees the time. Violette then realizes they have a party at a park in 30 minutes. A few seconds later Violette turns the TV off. Bill then realizes the park is hosting a hot dog eating contest. 10 minutes later Bill finishes changing into his eating suit. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill they are going to a fancy party. A few seconds later Bill walks into the kitchen. A few seconds later Bill grabs 3 gallons of mayonnaise. 5 minutes later Violette and the boys speed off to a park. 5 minutes later Bill runs towards the hot dog eating contest area. A few minutes later Bill gets the final spot in the contest. A few seconds later Bill grabs his mayonnaise. 10 minutes later Bill and 7 other competitors get ready. A few seconds later several workers place hundreds of hot dogs on a table. A few seconds later Bill finishes preparing his mayo. 3 minutes later the contest starts. 3 seconds later Bill starts shoving a disgusting amount of hot dogs and mayonnaise into his mouth. 5 minutes later the contest ends. A few seconds later Bill gets first place for eating 134 hot dogs. A few seconds later Violette walks over to the podium. A few seconds later Violette gets told everything. A few seconds later Violette starts to nag Bill for eating 42 pounds of food and mayo, consuming 92,000 calories in 5 minutes, missing the party, and looking like a slob. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys drive home. 5 minutes later Violette and William watch TV. A few seconds later Bill says he is hungry. Violette then tells Bill he can wait until dinner. A few seconds later Bill slaps Violette's rear end. Capital A. Few seconds later Violette ignores Bill's creepy behavior. A minute later Bill walks upstairs to sleep. 5 minutes later Violette hears snoring. A few seconds later Violette and William chat about getting revenge at Bill. A few minutes later Violette and William walk upstairs with steel baseball bats. A few seconds later Violette and William destroy Bill's secret chocolate stash that is hidden under the floorboard. A minute later Violette and William run for their lives when Bill opens his eyes. 2 minutes later Bill screams at the top of his lungs when he sees his destroyed chocolate stash. 5 seconds later Bill walks to the stairs. A few seconds later Bill trips on his foot. 3 seconds later Bill painfully crashes face first into a wall. A few seconds later Bill looks for his son and wife. A few seconds later Violette hears Bill cursing like a sailor. A few minutes later Bill finds them hiding on the basement stairs. A few seconds later Bill drags Violette and William away. A minute later Bill throws the two of them into his truck. 2 minutes later Bill speeds away. A few seconds later Violette and William jump out of the car. They crash land and only get small bruises and scrapes. A few seconds later Bill speeds away even faster. A minute later Violette and William lock up the house. 3 minutes later they hide in William's bedroom. 5 minutes later Violette finishes putting up a small barricade. A few seconds later Violette hears Bill's truck pull up. 5 minutes later Violette takes the barricade down. A few seconds later William hears a chainsaw. 2 minutes later Bill starts to chainsaw the door to William's bedroom. A few seconds later Violette screams for her life. 1 minute later the bedroom door falls over. A few seconds later Bill says he wants to explain what he did. 10 minutes later Bill finishes explaining what he did. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill to put it in the tool shed. Bill then walks away. A few seconds later Violette tells William it is dinner time. 20 minutes later Violette and William tuck into a salad. A few seconds later Bill grabs a 4-pound ham from the fridge. A few seconds later Bill sits on his chair. A few seconds later Bill starts forcing ham down his throat. 3 minutes later Bill finishes eating his ham. A few seconds later Violette and William wash the dishes. A few minutes later Violette tells Bill it is time for bed. A few seconds later Violette and the boys walk upstairs. 10 minutes later they are all fast asleep. 8 hours later Violette and William walk downstairs for breakfast. A few minutes later Violette and William tuck into some cold cereal for breakfast. A few seconds later Bill strolls into the kitchen. A few seconds later Violette hands Bill a bowl of shredded wheat. 3 seconds later Bill throws the cereal into the trash. Bill then asks for real food. A few seconds later Violette and Bill start arguing over shredded wheat. 10 seconds later Violette tells Bill that he should consider going on a diet and getting a gym plan. 1 second later Bill punches Violette. A few seconds later Bill runs for his life. Violette then ignores her fat ignorant creep of a husband. 10 seconds later Bill walks into the kitchen with his BB gun. 3 seconds later Bill shoots the box of shredded wheat. A few seconds later Bill puts the BB gun down. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill that they are going to be doing their weekly Safeway run. A few seconds later Bill grabs his shopping list. A few seconds later Violette and the boys get ready. 15 minutes later they speed off towards Safeway. 5 minutes later Violette and William grab a cart, and Bill grabs 2 carts. A few seconds later Bill starts running away. 15 minutes later Violette and William arrive at checkout. 10 minutes later William starts to help out the bagger. 3 minutes later Violette pays for the groceries. A few seconds later Bill arrives at the same lane with 2 carts overflowing with junk food. Violette then tells Bill he has to put the food back. A few seconds later Violette and William walk away. 1 second later Bill flips the 2 carts over. A few seconds later William helps out 3 workers to clean up the mess that Bill created. 10 seconds later Violette arrives at the mess. 5 minutes later they finish cleaning up. 2 minutes later Violette and William start to put bags of groceries into the trunk of Violette's SUV. 3 minutes later Violette and William get into the SUV with no signs of Bill anywhere. 5 minutes later Bill gets into the SUV with a bag of Wendy's. 10 seconds later Violette speeds home. 6 minutes later Violette and the boys bring in the groceries. 3 minutes later Violette and William finish putting the groceries away. A few seconds later Violette and William talk about going to a pasta buffet for lunch. A few seconds later Bill says he wants to eat some pasta. A few seconds later Violette decides they are going to a pasta buffet for lunch. A minute later Violette and the boys watch TV until lunchtime. 2 hours later they speed off to the closest all-you-can-eat pasta buffet. 16 minutes later Violette parks the SUV. A few seconds later Violette and the boys walk to the buffet. 3 minutes later they sat down at a table. A few seconds later Violette and William order water, while Bill orders 16 cups of Alfredo sauce. A few seconds later Violette quietly roars at Bill for his choice of beverage. 10 minutes later Bill's Alfredo sauce comes out. A few seconds later Bill sprints towards the pasta. Violette then tells William to be patient. 5 minutes later Bill returns to the table with 4 steamed trays each with 12 pounds of pasta. A few seconds later Violette screams at Bill. 3 seconds later Bill starts forcing a disgusting amount of pasta and sauce down his throat. A few seconds later Violette and William go to grab their pasta. 3 minutes later Violette and William start eating. A few minutes later the family finished eating. A few seconds later Bill says he is stuffed after eating about 19 pounds of food and Alfredo sauce. A few seconds later Violette slaps Bill for wasting 41 pounds of food. A few seconds later Bill says he was hungry for lunch. 5 seconds later Violette is handed a $300 check. 10 minutes later Violette and the boys walk out of the buffet after getting a lifetime ban. 2 minutes later Violette and the boys race home. 3 minutes later Violette and William walk into the house. A few seconds later Violette hears her SUV speed away. Violette then comes to the conclusion that Bill hijacked the SUV. A few seconds later William groans. 3 seconds later Violette and William talk. A few seconds later they decide Bill should get a punishment for his recent behavior. 3 minutes later they decide they should torch Bill's old car as a punishment. A few minutes later William finishes getting ready for Bill's punishment. A few seconds later Violette's SUV stops in front of the house. 2 seconds later William lights a paper towel on fire. 6 seconds later a massive fire engulfs Bill's car. 3 seconds later Bill gets out of the SUV. A few seconds later Bill thinks he needs to get revenge by blowing something up. A few seconds later Bill grabs a stick of dynamite out of his pocket. A few seconds later Bill decides that he should blow up Violette's monster paper shredder. A few seconds later Bill walks into the house. 2 minutes later Bill drops the paper shredder onto the street. 1 second later Violette sees her paper shredder. A few seconds later Bill lights up his dynamite. 2 seconds later Bill places the dynamite next to the shredder. Then the Anderson family run. A few seconds later a large explosion goes off. A few seconds later Violette sees her SUV is slightly damaged. A few seconds later Violette slaps Bill. 1 second later Violette sighs. Bill then walks inside. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill he has to wash some dirty dishes. A few seconds later Bill rips the dishwasher open. Violette then tells Bill he has to take the rack out. 1 second later William walks into the kitchen. A few seconds later Violette sees her son. Violette then tells William to get ready for the impending chaos. A few seconds later Bill starts throwing dishes into the dishwasher messily. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill to behave himself. 1 second later Bill screams very loudly. Bill then throws a plate to the floor. 1 second later Violette calls Bill a maniac. A few seconds later Bill starts throwing dishes to the floor in a fit of rage. A minute later Bill screams he hates dirty dishes. A few seconds later Bill screams with all his might. A minute later Bill tries to drag the dishwasher outside. A few seconds later Bill gives up. A few seconds later Violette starts shouting at Bill. A minute later Bill starts cleaning up his dishwashing disaster. A few minutes later Bill says he wants to go to Target. Violette then tells Bill they can go to Target. A few seconds later Violette calls for William from the stairwell. 2 minutes later the Anderson family speed off towards a Target. A few minutes later Violette parks her scorched SUV. A few seconds later Bill runs into a Target. A few seconds later Violette tells William to give it a minute. 2 minutes later people start fleeing the Target very quickly. Violette then turns the news on. A few seconds later Violette sees a police car arrive at the Target entrance. A few seconds later 2 police officers run into the Target. 10 minutes later the radio says suspect Bill Thomas Anderson caught after pulling the fire alarm as a prank. Violette then starts crying because she is losing her sanity from Bill. A minute later a police officer bangs on the driver window. Violette opens the window. A few seconds later the officer explains that Bill has been arrested for the night. Violette then knows she has a few hours of peace without her fat ignorant husband. A few seconds later Violette and William drive home. 5 minutes later they walk into the house. A few seconds later Violette and William walk into Violette's office. 10 minutes later they finished doing what they needed to do. A few seconds later Violette and William walk into the kitchen to cook an early supper. 15 minutes later Violette and William tuck into some steak and pork chop burritos. 5 minutes later William washes the dishes correctly. 10 minutes later Violette and William speed off to Home Goods to purchase some new dishware. 1 hour later they walk back into the house with $3,000 worth of dishware. A few minutes later Violette and William finish washing their new dishes. 5 minutes later they chat about life. 15 minutes later Violette throws on the movie Oppenheimer. 3 hours later Violette and William get ready for bed. 16 minutes later they get an early start to bed without the useless Bill. 9 hours later Violette and William walk downstairs for breakfast. An hour later Violette and William get into the SUV. A minute later they speed off to Mount Airy High School. 5 minutes later William walks into MAHS for his first day of senior year. A few seconds later William gets his schedule. William is pumped for the 2 half days in the week. A few seconds later he sees he has his teacher from past years. A minute later William walks into his one-on-one class with his 64-year-old teacher, Greg. A few seconds later Greg fist bumps William. Then the two of them start chatting about their summer breaks. Meanwhile, Violette is speeding towards the Mount Airy Police Department. 5 minutes later Violette walks into the police station. A few seconds later Violette and a police officer go to get Bill. 5 minutes later Bill is released. A few seconds later Violette talks with a police officer. A few minutes later Violette and Bill speed away. 10 minutes later Violette watches Bill walk into his office. A few seconds later Bill watches his wife drive away. A few seconds later Bill announces next to a security camera that he is going somewhere. A few seconds later Bill walks out of his office. 10 minutes later Bill walks into a random shack. Cheese. 5 minutes later Bill starts smashing arcade games because he has no money to play the games with. A few seconds later the owner of the CEC spots Bill. A few seconds later Bill gets a lifetime ban from the CEC. A few seconds later Bill screams very loudly. 1 second later Bill gets dragged outside against his will. 5 seconds later Bill sees a Wendy's. A few seconds later Bill walks towards Wendy's. 2 minutes later Bill orders a feast. Meanwhile, Violette is at home, getting some work done for her part-time job. A few seconds later Violette answers a call from Todd. 2 minutes later Violette screams with all her might when she is told about her husband. A few seconds later Violette grabs her car keys. Violette then ends the call while getting into her SUV. 15 seconds later Violette drives towards Work Job Incorporated. 3 minutes later Violette sprints up some stairs. 4 minutes later Violette walks into Todd's office. A few seconds later Todd explains everything. 10 minutes later Violette drives onto the streets of Mount Airy to find her husband. 5 minutes later Violette spots Bill at CEC. A minute later Bill gets into the SUV while being scolded. 8 minutes later Violette and Bill walk into Todd's office. Meanwhile at MAHS, Greg and William are eating snacks. A few minutes later Greg and William watch the Simpsons movie. 15 minutes later the dismissal bell goes off. A few seconds later William packs up his belongings. 10 minutes later Violette arrives at the front entrance. Capital A. Minute later Violette and William speed home. A few minutes later Violette and William walk into the house. A few seconds later they sit on the couch. Violette then explains everything that Bill did. A few minutes later William suggests they should torch Bill's iPhone as a punishment. Violette then chuckles with evil intent. A few seconds later William walks upstairs to play some video games. A minute later Violette starts to cook lunch. 10 minutes later Violette calls for William. 2 minutes later William and Violette tuck into some salad for lunch. 5 minutes later William loads up the dishwasher. A few minutes later Violette and William watch TV. 1 hour later Violette gets a call from Todd. Violette answers it. 1 minute later Violette tells William that they have to pick up Bill. A minute later Violette and William speed off towards Work Job Incorporated. 5 minutes later Bill gets into the SUV. 3 seconds later Violette punches Bill for getting fired. A few seconds later Bill explains he got fired for watching adult videos. Violette then freezes. A few seconds later Violette slams on the accelerator. 1 minute later they arrive home. A few seconds later Violette rips an iPhone out of Bill's hand. A few seconds later Violette storms into the house. 10 seconds later Violette walks outside with a flamethrower. 1 minute later Bill's iPhone is ablaze. 5 seconds later Bill dumps water on his flaming phone. A minute later Bill sees his iPhone is beyond repair. 1 second later Bill starts crying. A few seconds later Violette scolds Bill for his behavior. 5 seconds later Bill walks inside. A few seconds later Violette hears a crash. Violette then sees her living room TV has been busted. 1 second later William puts earplugs in. 3 seconds later Violette breathes in. A few seconds later Violette screams at Bill for busting the living room TV. A few seconds later Violette sighs. A minute later Violette crashes onto a couch. A few seconds later Violette tells Bill that she is defeated. Bill then starts dancing, thinking he has won something. A few seconds later Bill has the nerve to ask for his prize. 1 second later Violette gives Bill 2 middle fingers. 1 second later Bill screams with all his might. A few seconds later Bill starts crying and shouting that he wants to go to Subway for a sub. A minute later Violette gives in. 2 minutes later Violette and the boys speed away. 10 minutes later they walk into a Subway. A few minutes later Bill orders a meatball hoagie. A few seconds later a worker tells Bill that he can only have 5 slices of cheese. Bill then demands the worker to put on 6 slices. A few seconds later Bill starts threatening the worker. Violette then tries to intervene. 3 seconds later Bill screams with all his might. Violette then screams for everyone to get out of the subway. A minute later the subway is empty, except for an angry time bomb named Bill. 2 minutes later screaming and loud scary noises can be heard. A few seconds later massive crashing sounds start up. A few seconds later the 3 noises get louder and crazier. 3 seconds later William and Violette hide behind the SUV. 3 minutes later the subway starts shaking violently. 2 minutes later Bill runs out of the subway as it starts to collapse. 3 seconds later the subway collapses. A few seconds later Violette and William get into the SUV. A few seconds later Bill gets into the SUV. 1 second later Violette pushes Bill to the outside world. A few seconds later Violette and William speed home without Bill. A few seconds later Violette turns on a news station. 2 seconds later a reporter says angry childish adult wanted for destroying a subway over a slice of cheese. If you know this man, please hand him into the closest police station. Violette then smiles evilly. 1 minute later Bill gets into the SUV. A few seconds later Violette apologizes and says she is on Bill's side. A minute later Violette speeds to a police station. 5 minutes later Bill gets placed in shackles. A few seconds later Violette gets a $3,000 reward for capturing Bill. A few seconds later Violette and William speed home. 5 minutes later they crash onto the sofa. 2 hours later Violette and William head to bed extra early. 10 hours later Violette wakes up William. A minute later they walk downstairs. 20 minutes later Violette and William speed off to MAHS. 10 minutes later William walks into Greg's classroom. A few seconds later Greg and William chat about life. 5 minutes later William is given a small worksheet. 20 minutes later William looks out of a window. William then sees his father on a tractor. A few seconds later Greg sees Bill. 12 seconds later Greg and William rush into Headmaster Zach's office. A few seconds later Zach sees Bill destroying the field behind MAHS. A few seconds later Zach calls Violette. A few seconds later Zach explains everything to Violette. 10 seconds later Zach gets hung up on. Zach then says that he was hung up on. 1 second later William knows that Violette is probably boiling with rage. A few seconds later William tells Zach and Greg to get ready. 2 minutes later Violette sprints into Zach's office with a BB gun and a stormy look in her eyes. Violette then angrily looks out of a window. 1 second later Violette watches Bill drive onto the streets of Mount Airy. A few seconds later Violette's eyes start to glow red. Violette then runs towards her SUV, with rage filling her entire body. A few seconds later Violette gets into her SUV. 10 seconds later Violette chases down Bill. 5 minutes later Violette spots Bill at an all-you-can-eat fish buffet. A minute later Violette runs into the fish buffet. 2 seconds later Bill sees Violette. 1 second later Violette explodes with all her rage. Bill then ducks down. 2 seconds later Violette unleashes years of anger at Bill in a matter of seconds. 3 minutes later Violette calms down. 3 minutes later Violette and Bill speed back to MAHS. 5 minutes later Violette pushes Bill into Zach's office. A few minutes later Bill explains everything. A few seconds later, Bill is handed a check for $80,000. Bill then screams very loudly. A few seconds later, Bill slaps Greg for no reason. A few minutes later, Violette and the boys speed home. 5 minutes later, Violette drags Bill into the house. A few seconds later, Bill asks for lunch. Violette then tells Bill he doesn't deserve lunch. 1 second later, Bill starts crying. A few minutes later, Violette hands Bill a bowl of oatmeal for lunch. Bill then slaps Violette's jaw. A few seconds later, Violette sighs. A few seconds later, William starts playing Xbox. 5 minutes later, Bill turns the internet router off for no reason. A few seconds later, William puts his controller and headset on his bed. 1 minute later, William scolds his father for being a naughty man. A minute later, Bill drives off with Violette's SUV. A few seconds later, Violette starts twitching. 5 minutes later, Bill gets out of the SUV. A few seconds later, Violette tackles Bill. 1 second later, William watches his parents get into a deadly brawl. A few minutes later, William dumps ice cold cool water onto his parents. A few seconds later, Violette walks into her house. A few seconds later, Bill sits on his chair. A few minutes later, Violette screams very loudly. A few seconds later, Violette finishes getting medical help from William. Violette then hands Bill a box of used bandages. A few seconds later, Bill tells Violette to go away. A few seconds later, Violette slaps Bill. 1 second later, Bill asks for lunch. Violette then tells Bill to bleep off. A few minutes later, Violette hands Bill a bowl of spaghetti. 5 minutes later, Bill asks for more. Violette then tells Bill to frick off. A few minutes later, Violette and the boys watch TV on Violette's Chromebook. 6 hours later, Violette and William have dinner. Soon Bill eats an entire ham. An hour later, the family fall asleep. 8 hours later, Violette wakes up. A few seconds later, William walks out of his bedroom. A few seconds later, Violette and William walk downstairs for breakfast. 2 minutes later, Violette and William tuck into some frosted flakes. 10 seconds later, Bill walks into the kitchen. A few seconds later, Bill asks for breakfast. Violette then points to the box of frosted flakes. Bill then grabs the box. A few seconds later, Bill starts eating out of the box. 2 minutes later, Bill finishes eating his breakfast. 3 seconds later, Violette and William wash the dishes. 10 minutes later, Violette and the boys finish getting ready for the day. A few seconds later, they meet up in the living room. Violette then says they have to go to Target for a few items. A few seconds later, the boys agree. 2 minutes later, Violette and the boys get into Violette's SUV. A few seconds later, they buckle up. 1 minute later, Violette and the boys speed off towards Target. 10 minutes later, they arrive at a shopping mall. 3 minutes later, Violette parks the SUV near a Target. A few seconds later, Violette and William walk towards the store. A minute later, they grab a shopping cart. 5 minutes later, Violette pays for 3 items she desperately needed. A few seconds later, Bill arrives at the checkout with a $100 Lego Star Wars set. Violette then tells Bill that he has to put the set back. A few seconds later, Bill runs away. A few seconds later, Bill starts smashing stuff in the Target. 6 minutes later, Bill finished destroying 20% of the store. A few seconds later, Bill gets into the SUV. A few seconds later, Violette tells Bill they are going to a gas station before going home. Bill then sighs. A few seconds later, they speed away. 5 minutes later, they arrive at a gas station. A minute later, Violette starts filling the SUV gas tank up. Bill then gets out of the SUV. 3 seconds later, Bill runs into Richdale. 10 minutes later, Violette sees Bill place a mountain of snacks next to the checkout. A few seconds later, Violette tells Bill he can't get the snacks. A few seconds later, Bill quickly decides he should blow up the gas station to get back at Violette. A few seconds later, Bill opens the SUV trunk. A few seconds later, Bill grabs his duffel bag filled with various explosives. Meanwhile, inside the Richdale, Violette is warming up a hot pocket. A few minutes later, Violette and William get into the SUV. A few seconds later, William sees his father with a duffel bag. William then tells Violette about Bill. A few seconds later, Violette sees her blue whale-sized husband with his explosive duffel bag. A few seconds later, Violette tells a gas station employee about Bill. 10 seconds later, Violette slams the driver door to her SUV closed. Violette then frantically powers the SUV on. 5 seconds later, Violette and William drive away. A few seconds later, Bill sees his family drive off. 3 seconds later, Bill lights up a match. Bill then lights a rope on fire. 1 second later, Bill runs for his life. 10 seconds later, all the TNT goes off and the gas below the station explodes, which causes a massive fireball to ignite. Then surrounding houses explode and go ablaze. A few seconds later, a 97-car pileup quickly happens in a matter of seconds. Then a plane pilot sees the fireball, so the pilot calls ATC. Back on the ground, a massive wall of black smoke comes to existence. A few seconds later, Violette gets out of the SUV. Violette then sees the massive extent of what Bill has done. A few seconds later, Bill sprints past the SUV. Violette then drives after Bill. 10 seconds later, Violette rams her SUV into Bill, causing him to slam onto the asphalt. A few minutes later, a sea of police cars, fire trucks, ambulances, EPA vans, FBI vans, news vans, army vehicles, National Guard SUVs, helicopters, police vans, police trucks, K9 jeeps, and tanks arrive at the scene of Bill's act of terrorism. A few seconds later, the presidential motorcade arrives. A minute later, the president, Hank, gets out of his limo. A few seconds later, Violette and William meet Hank. A few seconds later, news agencies start broadcasting the act of terrorism. A few seconds later, Violette sees Twitter. Violette then sees the top trending with 2.9 million tweets is about Bill's gas station terrorism. Then Hank starts chatting with Violette and William. 10 minutes later, Violette sees a massive metal box. Then an FBI official explains that Bill has been captured. A few seconds later, Bill gets placed into an FBI van. A few seconds later, the van speeds off. 2 hours later, Violette and William walk into their house. 30 minutes later, they finish packing up to stay at the White House for national security reasons. 10 minutes later, Violette and William get into Hank's limo. An hour later, the presidential motorcade arrives at the White House. 2 hours later, Violette and William finish unpacking in a small cottage within the White House area. A few minutes later, Violette and William turn the news on to see the cleanup is underway. Then an FBI official comes onto the TV to explain that 729 people lost their lives during the gas station bomb and car crash and other things related to the terrorism. A few minutes later, Violette and William start crying. An hour later, Violette says she got a presidential divorce. William then starts dancing because the vile stain of Bill isn't ruining the Anderson family name anymore. A few hours later, Violette and William head to bed. 8 hours later, Violette and William wake up. A few seconds later, Violette and William walk into the kitchen of their White House cottage. 3 minutes later, Violette and William eat some breakfast. 15 minutes later, Violette and William get ready for the day by showering and getting their wedding clothes. 20 minutes later, Violette and William finish getting ready for the day. A few seconds later, Violette and William walk towards the Oval Office. 3 minutes later, Hank greets the Anderson family. A few seconds later, Violette and William and Hank find the presidential motorcade staff. 10 minutes later, the three of them get driven to the Supreme Court of the United States. 15 minutes later, Violette, William, and Hank walk into the courtroom of the Supreme Court. A minute later, they sit down in the plaintiff chairs. A few minutes later, Bill gets wheeled out to the defendant table. A few seconds later, Violette hands Bill some divorce papers. A minute later, Clarence Thomas comes to the judge podium. A minute later, Clarence declares the trial has begun. A few seconds later, 3 news agencies start broadcasting the trial worldwide. An hour later of boring court nonsense, the witnesses get allowed to speak. A few seconds later, a massive line of witnesses came out of the jury door. 6 hours later, the final witness finishes speaking. A few minutes later, 3 FBI executives come to the witness stand. A few seconds later, Bill says he is hungry. 1 second later, the FBI director says everyone, after reviewing footage from 982 cameras showing an entire sphere of every angle imaginable of the terrorism act committed solely by Bill Thomas J. We at the FBI have concluded that 729 people haven't died. We unfortunately have to say that over 1,800 people have lost their lives, including 489 on a single plane. The plane was caught in the smoke and crashed into a World War II hangar. Lots of fuel was at that base, which exploded, and another 482 people died from the aftermath. With this loss of life, we have decided that all of Maryland, District Columbia, Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania will be on lockdown and no one will be able to enter or leave the states. The lockdown will be effective in 48 hours and will last 2 weeks. The senators have also made the choice to put the government on a partial shutdown and be 10% slower than normal function. All planes leaving or entering the United States will be delayed and rerouted for 72 hours. That is all for now. Then a video starts showing some of Bill's escapades over the years. 2 hours later, the trial ended for the day. An hour later, Violette and William walk into their temp cottage. 20 minutes later, Violette and William head to bed. 9 hours later, Violette and William get into one of Hank's limos. 15 minutes later, Hank and the Anderson family sit down at the plaintiff table again. An hour later, Clarence starts up the trial again. A few minutes later, Violette and William are let up to the witness stand. 1 minute later, William says a little about his experiences with Bill. 5 minutes later, Violette says, "Hello world. I am Violette Anderson, the former husband of the vile human known as Bill Thomas J. I am here to explain every major thing that Bill has done. I will be skipping the smaller bad deeds he has done to avoid the speech taking too long. I will be starting off when William was just born. I was recovering in the ICU. Bill was nowhere during the delivery. Then he randomly walked into my ICU room with a wheelbarrow containing 38 bags from a Wendy's about a fifth of a mile away from the hospital where I delivered my son. I was beyond furious at him for missing a very precious moment in our marriage. I asked Bill why he missed the birth. Bill didn't say a word. He was too busy stuffing his face with chicken nuggets. I was angry at him. So I punched my ignorant husband. Bill then stole my blanket as a prank. Then a security officer detained Bill. Then Bill was thrown out of the hospital. Then 2 days pass, and I arrive at my house. Bill was in the kitchen stuffing his face with ham cubes. He refused to help me with William. Bill wanted a baby girl. So he didn't help out with my son at all. This made me resent Bill. 6 years later of minor escapades, William started in the 1st grade. Bill was about 400 pounds at the time. William was excited to start going to elementary school. William was about to get on the school bus. Then out of nowhere, Bill told my son that he could have a miserable day. Then he called William a jerk and dingbat. That was the start of those 2 nicknames. William was upset at his father. William then got driven to school. Eventually, William came home crying. William told me that Bill destroyed the playground at his school. I turned the news on. Then a news reporter started talking about the playground. I was beyond enraged. Bill was doing 2 to 3 escapades per day. As the days went on, William became more anxious to get on the school bus. So I went with William to school for a day. Halfway into the day, Bill arrived at the school with a few glitter bombs and stink bombs. Soon the school smelled like a skunk and glitter was everywhere. We evacuated and Bill was detained. An hour passed when he was released. Now he had an ankle monitor to track his movements. 2 months later, Bill got arrested at a Six Flags for loosening a fastener on a roller coaster. Fortunately, they caught Bill in his act and no negative things happened. The fastener was secured and everything was normal. I was beyond furious. Bill was hauled away in a prison bus. A day later, Bill was released. I was getting to my wits' end. I was losing it because I couldn't handle his behavior. On another topic, Bill once stole a tractor that belonged to William's middle school groundskeeper. From my memory, it was a quiet May morning. I was driving William to school. Bill was getting ready for the day. About 20 minutes later into the day, I was at home. I thought Bill was at work. Then I got a call from the headmaster of the school of William. Suddenly, I wondered if my perfect son did something bad. I then answered the call. My emotions went from all over the place to pure rage when I heard the word Bill. I grabbed my SUV keys and drove to the school. Soon I arrived to see my ugly husband on the groundskeeper's tractor, destroying a parking lot. Bill spotted me, so he drove onto the streets of the town we lived in, which is Mount Airy, Maryland. I ran towards the headmaster's office, my body ready to burst with rage. Soon I was told that I was going to have to pay over $7 million to repair the damages that Bill caused. I screamed with all my might. I relaxed and came to my senses. I ran towards my SUV. I drove to find Bill. An hour passed with no results. Then I miraculously saw the tractor outside an all-you-can-eat seafood buffet. I ran into the buffet, only to see Bill stuffing his face with shrimp. Bill then saw me, so he ran for his life. I chased my fat husband down. I was unable to get him before he drove away with my SUV. I called the police. A couple of minutes later a police car picked me up. Then I opened a tracker app, with a tracker linked to my SUV. Bill stole my SUV so much that I had to put a tracker on the SUV. 10 minutes passed, when we spotted Bill at a Wendy's drive-thru. 19 police cars surrounded my SUV. Eventually we arrived back at the school. Bill was tied down in a chair in the headmaster's office. Then the headmaster had to make an intercom announcement explaining everything. An hour passed, when the Mount Airy mayor, Jensen, walked into the room. Bill said he would do anything if he could get out of going to jail or prison. So Jensen decided that Bill was going to work Saturdays for the rest of his life or until the debt he racked up for himself was paid off. Then his first Saturday rolled around. It was 7 o'clock. I was trying to get Bill up, to no avail. Then an hour passed and we finally got into my SUV. I had to bribe Bill with food to get him to cooperate. 10 minutes later I dropped Bill off. Then I drove around the block with William, because I knew in my heart that Bill was going to do something illegal. About 5 minutes later I got a call from Jensen. I was informed that Bill made a flood in the basement. When he busted a pipe, I drove back to the house. Then I ran inside faster than Usain Bolt's highest speed recorded. I found Bill in a flooded basement. I was beyond angry. I punched Bill with all my might. An hour passed when Jensen's house collapsed. I dragged Bill to my SUV. We drove home in under 2 minutes. Once at our house, me and William gave Bill a brutal punishment day. After 12 brutal punishments, Bill only lit my laptop on fire. I was enraged at Bill. It was at this point, Bill was doing 3 escapades per day. Then years went on with no changes. Now we are in the early summer of this year. I was starting a part-time job from home. Bill was finishing getting ready for work. Bill eventually told me that he doesn't want me to get money for the family, so he lit my $700 laptop on fire. I doused the fire, but it was destroyed. I was so enraged at Bill. I slapped him and kicked him many times. Now we arrive, where I know the truth of why Bill did what he did. We arrived at the gas station. Bill ran into Richdale. He got some 80 snacks. I told Bill that he couldn't get the snacks. So he decided to commit terrorism. Now we are here, in the middle of his trial. To wrap up, the only good thing I got out of this marriage was my son. Everything else I regret marrying him. I hate this soulless piece of crap with every fiber in my body. Bill is a vile stain to the United States name. I am done. Violette and William then walk back to their seats. 10 minutes later Bill gets to speak. Bill starts screaming really offensive things that are too bad to even mention here. 3 minutes later Bill gets tased. A few minutes later Clarence asks the jury about the trial. The entire jury says Bill is guilty. A few seconds later Clarence says Bill, you are found guilty for breaking 78% of every law in the United States. That includes every federal crime in the country. I hereby sentence you to 20 years in Black Dolphin prison. Then the rest of your miserable life will be spent in a Bashiri prison in Japan. Case adjourned. Bill is then wheeled away while on worldwide news. A few hours later Violette and William head to bed. 8 hours later Violette and William wake up excited for their new chapter in their books of life. The end.